in this lesson, let's use curves to add some tubes to our mech. So if we jump back in here, this body of the mech is one of the more difficult pieces. I know we jumped right into it, but I'm confident that you're able to accomplish that just by drawing it in, following us step by step as we go through that. So now let's kind of take a break and do something a little bit different, and we'll add some kind of pipes and tubes to this, kind of add a little bit more detail. And we can do that using curves. So let's go over to the side view, so just hitting the space bar. And to draw out our curves, let's go ahead and go to Create. And there are several different kinds of curves that we can create. Let's just use the basic CV curve tool. Let's start to click along this line. So I'm going to click, start at the front, and kind of click my way up all the way down here. Hit Enter when you're done. So you can roughly create that curve. You can also access the components just like with our other objects by right-clicking or going to component mode. We can select those points and we can start to move those around from the side view. We can also go into our perspective view. You can see since we drew it from the side, it's actually at the origin, but you don't see our pivot anywhere, even though we've got our move tool set. That's because it's all the way down there at the origin of every axis. So to really quickly center your pivot, you can go to Modify, Center Pivot, and then we can just move this curve over into kind of a rough position there. All right, we can right click, go to Control Vertex, and we can begin to move these points around a little bit. So maybe create a little bit more shape there. Maybe these can sort of come in. And I really want the curve to kind of come straight into the geometry versus at an angle, just because it'll look better and we'll be able to make a kind of a seal that goes around it that'll make it look a little bit better as well. So we can sort of come in here. We can start to move these points in, in different axes if we need to. If you want this to more kind of connect up in the center of our thruster, we can sort of move it over a bit. And so we can just kind of move those points around until we get something that kind of defines where we want our tube to be. Now right now there's no geometry there. We can't see the tube if we render it. There's not really anything there but a curve. So we need to create the geometry. Let's use NURBS to do this. So we've got a NURBS curve. Let's use another NURBS curve. So we're going to go up to Create NURBS Primitives, and let's create a circle. Now the circle is going to come in at the origin down here. We don't really need to move it or do anything else besides leave it selected. Shift select the curve that we drew out. And then we're going to make sure we're in the Surfaces menu set. And then we're going to go to Surfaces. And let's see what happens if we just hit Extrude. So something's happened. It's created some new geometry, but it's not really what we want. So let's take a look at the options and see what we can do to get the geometry to flow along this path. So go to Surfaces again. This time we'll open up the options. The style is set to 2, which is what we want. The resulting position, we don't want it to be at the profile. That's the circle. We want it to be at the path. So we'll choose at the path. Let's apply it, see if that's any better. Well, it has moved up to the path, but it's not following along the path. So let me undo that and click one more thing. On the pivot, let's change this to component. Okay, now let's apply and see what happens. So now we've got some geometry flowing along our path. You'll notice the shape of that is a circle shape. Okay, so it's taking the circle, it's flowing it along the path that we created and creating geometry. Now there is a history connection with this piece of geometry. You can see it down here. We've got this node. So one of the cool things about that is I can go ahead and grab that circle. Remember the circle we created, just sitting there at the origin. I'll go into the Make Circle node. Let's grab the radius and I'll middle mouse drag it. And you can see as I change that radius, the geometry automatically updates. I'm not changing anything directly on the geometry. I'm just changing the radius of that initial circle that we created, and it's automatically updating that geometry. So we can come in and kind of get it the thickness that we want. Now if I want to make another tube, Or you can see, actually, before we do that, you can see where this is kind of right on the edge there. It's not really penetrating all the way in. Well, I'm going to just drag across this, and this actually, I know, selects the geometry and the curve, and then I'll control click the geometry. So now I just have that curve selected. I'll right click, control vertex, and I can drag across here, and I'm just going to pull this down in a little bit more so that we do have that penetration, and I want it to come in again at more of a right angle. And so I'll just modify this, and you can see the history works that way too. I can modify that path curve and the geometry updates. All right, so let's select that curve, and I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate it. I'm just going to move it over a little bit. I'm going to create a second tube, so kind of pull this down a little bit. We can kind of move these, kind of pull this out a little and just make it a little bit different so the bends and things aren't all in the same places. All right, now let's create a second curve, a second circle that is, and then we'll just repeat that. Okay, we can go back in now and select that other NURB circle, and let's change the radius a little bit. So we'll make that a little bit bigger. So now we've got two tubes that have differing widths. Now if you had multiple path curves and you wanted to use the same circle on those, you could, and that way, you know, if you modified that circle, it would change the size of all of those paths, or all of those tubes rather. All right, you can see where this is extending past. That's not really what we want. So let me grab those points and just move them in a little bit. Now, whenever I have geometry just sticking right into another piece like this, especially kind of a tube or something like that, a lot of times it's good to create some sort of a visual seal or break on that. We can do that by going to Create, and let's just create some NURBS, a NURBS torus. Kind of move it up and over. Kind of bring it into a rough sort of position here. There we go. Let's make it a little bit bigger, so we'll go into the creation settings here. We'll increase our radius. Let's kind of rotate it, and we want it to go right around our tube there. Kind of pull it up a little bit. Let's take our height ratio down a little. I want it to be a bit thinner. And then we'll have to take our radius down a little bit too. I want it to fit sort of right around that tube. And then you'll have to rotate it a bit. And you kind of see now why I wanted this to come in at not too shallow of an angle. But even though it's hard to see, it really adds a lot when you have those sort of visual seals and details on, so it doesn't look like it's just penetrating right into a piece of geometry. So have some fun with drawing out some curves. Use some different profiles to create the shapes. In this case, we just use a circle to create a tube sort of shape, and then go in and add some sort of seals to that. Now the next thing that we'll do is to take one of these tubes and we'll convert it into a polygon shape, and where we can then start to add some additional detail to it. So let's do that next.